A single mother finds a dying man on her property. She decides to help him, and in doing so, she unleashes a storm that could destroy not just her family, but her entire town. This is a story about secrets, the kind that fester in the dark corners of a quiet place, and what happens when one good deed threatens to drag them all into the light. You're not going to want to miss a second of this. The sun in Dove's Hollow didn't just shine, it punished. It baked the red earth until it cracked and turned the air into a shimmering haze. From her window, Miriam Callahan watched that sunset, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. She was a widow, a mother of two, and a pariah. Her husband, the town's former minister, had died of a fever, leaving her with nothing but his Bible and a house full of whispers. The town folk judged her for not grieving loudly enough, for not falling apart in the way they expected. They didn't know she'd done all her grieving while he was still alive, while she was trying to be the quiet, pious wife he demanded. Her son Jonah sat at the table, his charcoal pencil scratching across a piece of paper. He was drawing the broken-down barn across the way, capturing its loneliness. Her daughter Ruthie was chattering about coyotes and falling stars, her imagination a wildfire in their tiny, quiet house. It was a fragile piece, but it was theirs, and Miriam guarded it fiercely. That's when Jonah froze, his pencil hovering in midair. He stared out the window, his eyes wide. Ruthie went silent, following his gaze. Miriam's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked, and she saw him. A man was crumpled beneath one of the cottonwood trees by the stream. He was a heap of torn buckskin and tangled black hair. Even from a distance, she could see the unnatural way his body was bent, the way his shoulders shook with pain. Beside him, a horse stood with its head bowed low, as if it were mourning him already. Miriam set her teacup down. She looked at her children, their faces pale with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Stay here," she said, her voice tight, but she knew they wouldn't. She grabbed an old flannel sheet and a basin of water. Then, with her children trailing behind her like two small shadows, she stepped out into the oppressive heat. She was walking toward a man who was either dying or already dead, and she had no idea that by taking those steps, she was lighting a fuse. The closer she got, the worse it was. The scent of sun-baked earth was mixed with something else, something coppery and metallic. Blood. The man was kneeling in the shallow water of the stream, clutching his leg. The water around him was stained a dirty, swirling red. He was alive, but barely. His clothes were shredded, his face was a mask of dirt and sweat. But it was the wound that made her stomach clench. It wasn't a clean shot. It was jagged, torn, as if something had ripped a piece of him away. His eyes were squeezed shut, but as she knelt beside him, he managed to pry one open. It was dark, fathomless, and filled with an agony that stole her breath. "Please," he rasped, the word cracking in his throat. His English was heavy, dragged from a deep place of exhaustion. Miriam's mind raced. He'd been like this for a while. The blood was dark, starting to congeal. He must have been bleeding for hours, maybe all night. This man wasn't just hurt, he was being hunted. Every instinct, every whisper of self-preservation screamed at her to turn around, to grab her children and lock the door, to forget she ever saw him. This was not her fight. This was trouble, the kind that didn't just knock on your door, it kicked it down. But then she looked at her daughter, Ruthie, whose eyes were filled not with fear, but with a profound, heartbreaking pity. And she looked at Jonah, who was clutching her skirt, trembling, but watching her, waiting to see what she would do. They were her husband's children, yes, but they were hers too, and she would not teach them to turn their backs on a man in need, no matter the cost. "All right then," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Let's get you inside." Getting him back to the house was a nightmare. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight that leaned on her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Jonah and Ruthie did what they could, their small hands trying to support his arm, their faces set with grim determination. They laid him on the spare cot in the back room, a piece of furniture that hadn't been used since her husband passed. Miriam worked quickly, her old nursing skills coming back in a rush. She cut away the torn buckskin, her breath catching at the sight of the wound. It was worse up close. The flesh was mangled, the edges bruised a sickening purple. But there was something else. Seared into the skin just above the gash was a mark, a symbol. It looked like a stylized snake eating its own tail. It was a brand, deliberately, brutally burned into his skin. This wasn't a random attack. This was a message. And just as that horrifying realization settled in her gut, a heavy, authoritative knock echoed through the small house. It was the kind of knock that expected an answer. Miriam froze, a blood-soaked cloth in her hand. The children looked at her, their eyes wide with terror. Someone knew. Someone had followed him. The knock came again, harder this time. Miriam took a deep breath, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked to the door. She opened it just a crack. Standing on her porch, silhouetted against the dying sun, was Sheriff Elias Truel. His face was all sharp angles and suspicion, his badge the only thing that caught the light. He wasn't a bad man. Not really, but he was a man who hated things he couldn't neatly categorize. And Miriam knew, with a sickening certainty, that a bleeding, branded Apache man in the back of a preacher's widow's house was something he would never understand. "Miriam," he said, his voice low and flat. He didn't tip his hat. "Heard some commotion." His eyes weren't on her. They were scanning, trying to peer past her into the dim light of the cabin. "Just the children playing," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. But Elias's gaze was sharp. He could smell the blood, or maybe he could just smell the lie. "Funny," he said, taking a slow step forward. "Sounded more like dragging." He pushed the door open a little wider, just enough to see past her. His eyes locked on the back room, where a sliver of light revealed the man's still form on the cot. Elias's whole body went rigid. His gaze snapped back to Miriam, and it was cold as a winter stone. "You know who that is?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She shook her head, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "He was hurt, Elias. I couldn't just leave him." "Hurt?" Elias let out a short, bitter laugh. "Ma'am, that man is more than hurt. He's a ghost that a lot of powerful people want to see put back in the ground for good." Before she could ask what he meant, a low groan came from the back room. The stranger was stirring. Elias's jaw clenched so tight she could hear his teeth grind. He looked from the room to the terrified faces of her children huddled in the corner, and then back to her. His expression was unreadable. "You just invited the devil into your home, Miriam," he said softly. "I hope for your sake, and for theirs, that you know how to make him leave." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the stranger, the brand, and 100 terrifying questions. The fire in the hearth spit and crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The man on the cot was still, his breathing shallow but steady. Miriam had done what she could for the wound, cleaning it and binding it with fresh cloth. But Elias's words echoed in the small cabin. A ghost that powerful people want to see put back in the ground. She sat in the worn armchair, the one that used to be her husband's. Jonah and Ruthie were pressed against her, their small bodies trembling. They were no longer filled with pity, only fear. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with unspoken dread. What had she done? Who was this man? And who was coming for him? As if he'd heard her thoughts, the man's eyes fluttered open. They weren't hazy with pain anymore. They were sharp, intelligent, and focused directly on her. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. Then his voice, though weak, was clear. "Thank you," he said. He looked over at her children, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. He looked at her son. "Jonah?" He said the name like a statement, not a question. Then he looked at her daughter. "Ruthie." Miriam's breath hitched. How could he possibly know their names? She had never spoken them in his presence. Her mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Had he heard her whisper to them outside? Was he delirious? But his eyes were perfectly lucid. There was no fever there, only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. How do you know their names?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The man's lips curved into a faint, sad smile. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he looked at her, truly looked at her, and his next words sent a chill down her spine. "It's you I didn't recognize at first, Miriam. You've changed." He knew her name, too. This wasn't some random stranger who had collapsed on her land. This man knew her. He knew her children, and she had absolutely no idea who he was. The next few days passed in a tense, surreal haze. The man who told them to call him Nikai, which he said meant wanderer, slowly began to heal. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were few and deliberate. He never explained how he knew their names, and Miriam, sensing a deep well of pain behind his eyes, found she couldn't bring herself to press him. She told herself it was because he needed a rest, but the truth was, she was afraid of the answer. Fear was a constant companion now. Every snapped twig outside, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She was waiting for Elias to come back, or worse, for the powerful people he'd mentioned. But the only visitor they had was the silence. Nikai's presence had changed the shape of it. It was no longer the empty, lonely silence of grief. It was a watchful, waiting silence. He'd sit in the chair by the hearth for hours, his hands busy carving a small piece of wood he'd found, his eyes seeing things that weren't in the room. The children, however, seemed to forget their fear. Children have a way of accepting the impossible. Ruthie, bold as ever, would bring him her storybook, a collection of her own fantastical tales and Jonah's drawings. She'd chatter on about wolves who married the moon and mountains that could walk. Nikai would listen patiently, a flicker of amusement in his dark eyes. One evening, Jonah, who had been watching Nikai from a distance for days, silently approached and handed him a folded piece of paper. It was his finished sketch of the cottonwood scene, but he had added something. In the drawing, a ghostly figure of a woman stood beside the slumped man, her hand outstretched, a light emanating from her palm. Nikai studied the drawing for a long time. "You see things that others don't," he said quietly to Jonah. The boy flushed with pride. A fragile, unspoken bond began to form between the silent man and the two children. They were drawn to his stillness, to the sense of ancient calm that surrounded him, even as Miriam felt the storm gathering on the horizon. One afternoon, as she was stirring a pot of stew, she caught herself humming. The sound was so foreign she stopped, her spoon hovering in midair. She couldn't remember the last time she'd hummed. Nikai was watching her from the table. "Why did you help me?" he asked, his voice soft. The question hung in the air between them. She thought of a dozen answers. Because it was the right thing to do. Because my children were watching. But none of them felt true. She turned to him, the spoon still in her hand. "Because my husband would have told me not to," she said, the words tasting like rebellion on her tongue. "He was a man of God, but his God was a narrow, fearful one. Helping you. It was the first thing I've done in years that felt like it was my own decision." Nikai nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "That," he said, "is a reason I understand." In that moment, something shifted. The wall of fear and suspicion that Miriam had built around her heart cracked just a little. She saw not just a wounded stranger, but a man who understood what it meant to be trapped. But that fragile moment of connection was shattered a week later. They needed supplies, and there was no putting it off any longer. She hitched the wagon, leaving Nikai at the cabin at his quiet insistence. He knew as she did that his presence in town would be like throwing a lit match into a barrel of gunpowder. Dove's Hollow was just as she remembered, dusty, quiet, and simmering with judgment. As she was buying flour at the general store, Mrs. Thistle, the new preacher's wife, cornered her by the pickle barrel. Her smile was all teeth and no warmth. "I heard you've taken in a stray, Miriam," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "Caleb, bless his heart, always said you had a soft spot for lost causes." The mention of her husband's name was like a slap. "He was wounded," Miriam said, her voice tight. "I couldn't just let him die." Mrs. Thistle's smile tightened. "Of course not, dear. But one must be careful. There are lines. People in this town appreciate those lines." Her eyes flicked toward the street. Miriam followed her gaze. Across the way, Sheriff Truwell stood, arms crossed, watching the store. Watching her. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a promise. That night, she told Nikai what had happened. He listened without expression, his hand still carving the piece of wood. "They think I have fallen," she said. the bitterness rising in her throat. He looked up from his carving, his dark eyes meeting hers across the firelit room. His next words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. "They are not worried that you have fallen, Miriam," he said. "They are worried that you are learning to fly." His words struck a chord so deep inside her, she felt it vibrate through her bones. But before she could even process what he meant, a new sound cut through the night. It wasn't a knock this time. It was the sound of splintering wood, followed by a child's terrified scream. They both shot to their feet. The scream had come from the front porch. Miriam's blood ran cold. She raced to the door, Nakai right behind her, and threw it open. Jonah was standing there, his face as white as a sheet, pointing a trembling finger at the porch steps. Lying there was a dead rabbit, its throat slit from ear to ear. Pinned to its fur with a rusty nail was one of Jonah's drawings. It was the one he had given to Nakai, the one of the woman healing the man. But now it was different. Someone had taken a piece of charcoal and drawn a crude, thick circle around the figures of Miriam and the children. And through the center of the circle they had drawn a stark, black X. This wasn't a warning from the town gossips anymore. This was a threat, a direct, violent message. And it wasn't meant for Nakai. It was meant for her. "They know," Nakai whispered, his voice grim. He wasn't looking at the rabbit. He was looking out into the darkness beyond the porch light, his body coiled like a spring. "They know you're protecting me." "Who are they?" Miriam demanded, her voice shaking as she pulled a terrified Jonah into her arms. "The people who did this to me," he said, his hand unconsciously going to the scarred brand on his leg. "The men who own this valley, the men your husband used to preach for." The world tilted on its axis. "My husband?" she stammered. "What does Caleb have to do with this?" Nakai turned to her, and the look in his eyes was one of profound sorrow. "Your husband didn't just preach for them, Miriam. He kept their secrets, the darkest one of all." Before she could ask, the sound of hoofbeats echoed in the distance, fast and frantic, coming their way. Nakai grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "There's no more time. They're coming." He looked at the children, then back at her, his face a mask of desperation. "You have to make them believe you turned me in. You have to be the one to hand me over." Miriam stared at him, horrified. "No, I won't. You must," he hissed, his eyes wild. "It's the only way to keep your children safe." The hoofbeats were closer now, a thundering rhythm that matched the frantic beating of her own heart. She was trapped. If she protected him, she was putting a target on her children's backs. If she betrayed him, she would be handing him over to the very men who had branded him and left him for dead. There was no right choice, only a series of impossible wrongs. The riders were almost upon them. She could hear the jingle of harnesses, the grunts of the horses. Nakai gave her one last desperate look. "Tell them you were afraid. Tell them you did it for the reward. Make them believe it, Miriam. Your life depends on it." Just as the first rider burst into the clearing, a large, imposing figure on a black horse, Sheriff Truel suddenly appeared from the shadows at the side of the house. He had his gun drawn, but it wasn't pointed at Nakai. It was pointed at the rider. "That's far enough, Bartlett," Elias yelled, his voice tight with tension. "This is my town." The man named Bartlett, a bear of a man with a cruel face and a long duster coat, laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound. "Your town, Truel. This whole valley belongs to my family, and we're here for our property." He gestured with his chin toward Nakai. Nakai stood his ground, his body tensed, ready for a fight he knew he couldn't win. Miriam stood frozen between them, her mind reeling. Bartlett. The Bartlett family owned the biggest cattle ranch in the state. They were notoriously ruthless, a law unto themselves. They were the powerful people. And her husband, her quiet, pious Caleb, had kept their secrets? "He's under my protection," Elias said, though his hand was shaking slightly. Bartlett's sneer widened. "Is he now? That's a shame, because we have a warrant, signed by the circuit judge himself, for horse theft." He pulled a piece of paper from his coat. "Now, you can either step aside, or you can die with him." Elias faltered. A judge's warrant tied his hands. His authority meant nothing. The other riders, about 5 of them, began to spread out, effectively surrounding the small cabin. They all had rifles. It was over. Miriam looked at Jonah and Ruthie, huddled in the doorway, their small faces streaked with tears. She looked at Nakai, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and she looked at the warrant in Bartlett's hand. Horse theft. It was a lie. She knew it. They were here for something else. They were here to silence him. Suddenly Nakai's desperate words echoed in her mind. Make them believe you did it for the reward. It was a long shot, a crazy gamble, but it was the only card she had left to play. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, pushing past Elias. There's a reward, she asked, forcing her voice to sound greedy and a little bit desperate. Bartlett looked down at her from his horse, surprised. A handsome one, he said, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. Why? You the one who turned him in? Miriam swallowed the bile that rose in her throat. She couldn't look at Nakai. I am, she said, her voice shaking but clear. He collapsed on my property. I sent word to the sheriff as soon as I realized who he was. The reward money, my children and I, we could use it. A heavy silence fell over the clearing. The riders exchanged confused glances. Elias stared at her, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. She could feel Nikai's eyes boring into her back, a look of profound betrayal that she knew would haunt her for the rest of her life. But she held her ground, forcing herself to meet Bartlett's cold, calculating gaze. He studied her for a long moment, then let out another booming laugh. Well, I'll be. The preacher's widow has a little bit of snake in her after all. I like that. He dismounted, his boots thudding on the hard-packed earth. All right, boys, he called out to his men. Tie him up. The lady gets her silver. Two of his men moved toward Nikai, who didn't resist. He let them bind his hands, his face a stony, unreadable mask. As they dragged him toward a spare horse, his eyes met Miriam's one last time. There was no anger in them, only a deep, devastating understanding. He knew what she was doing. He was playing his part in her desperate lie. As Bartlett's men secured Nakai, the rancher turned back to Miriam, pulling a heavy leather pouch from his belt. Here you are, ma'am. 30 pieces of silver. He tossed the pouch to her. It landed in the dirt at her feet. The biblical reference was not lost on her. It was a deliberate, cruel insult. Pleasure doing business with you, Bartlett sneered. He mounted his horse and, without a backward glance, led his men away, with Nikai trailing behind, a prisoner. Miriam stood there, trembling, as the sound of hoofbeats faded into the night. She had saved her children, but she had just condemned an innocent man to death. Elias walked over to her, his face grim. You did what you had to do, Miriam, he said softly, but his words offered no comfort. She looked down at the pouch of money in the dirt. Then she looked at the dead rabbit on her porch. She had bought her children's safety, but the price had been her soul. And as she stood there, a terrible thought began to dawn on her. This wasn't over. It wasn't even close. Bartlett and his men didn't just want Nakai silenced. They wanted something he had, and they would be back for it. The silence that descended after they left was worse than the noise. It was a thick, suffocating blanket of guilt and fear. Jonah and Ruthie were inconsolable. They didn't understand the nuance of her betrayal. They only knew that the quiet man who listened to their stories had been dragged away, and their mother had let it happen. She tried to explain, but the words felt like ash in her mouth. How could she explain that she had traded one man's life for theirs? That night she couldn't sleep. She sat in the dark, the heavy pouch of coins sitting on the table like a curse. 30 pieces of silver, the price of betrayal. She kept seeing Nikai's face, the look of understanding in his eyes just before they took him. He had trusted her to play her part. But what was the next act? Elias had stayed for a while, his presence a strange mixture of comfort and accusation. Before he left, he'd stopped at the door. For what it's worth, he'd said, not looking at her, Caleb was in deep with the Bartletts, deeper than anyone knew. He held some of their legal papers for them, deeds, contracts. He thought it was just business. By the time he realized what kind of monsters they were, it was too late. He was trapped. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Her husband, the righteous man of God, had been a business partner with men like Bartlett. It recontextualized their whole life together, his constant anxiety, his rigid adherence to rules, his fear of stepping out of line. He hadn't been pious, he'd been terrified. What kind of secrets? She'd asked Elias, her voice a hoarse whisper. The kind people kill for, he'd replied. The original land deeds for this valley. The Bartletts don't own it. They stole it. From Nakai's people. Everything clicked into place. Nakai wasn't just a random wanderer. He was a descendant of the land's rightful owners. The brand on his leg wasn't just a mark of cruelty. It was a symbol of ownership. The Bartletts' twisted way of claiming him like cattle. And he must have had proof. That's what they were really after. Not him, but something he carried. Suddenly, she remembered the small leather pouch he always wore around his neck. The one he never took off, not even when she was cleaning his wounds. She had to get it. She had to find out what was inside. But how? Bartlett's ranch was like a fortress. Just then, her eyes fell on the old cedar trunk in the corner of the room. It was filled with Caleb's things, his sermons, his worn-out shirts, his Bible. She hadn't been able to bring herself to open it since he died, but now a desperate idea began to form. Caleb was trapped. He was a man of God, but he was also a man who wrote everything down. Every sermon, every thought, every transaction. What if he left something behind? A confession? A clue? With trembling hands, she opened the trunk. The smell of old paper and cedar filled the air. She dug past the neatly folded shirts and stacks of sermons until her fingers hit something hard. It was a false bottom. She pried it open, and inside, lying on a bed of yellowed newspaper, was a leather-bound ledger in a single sealed envelope addressed to her in Caleb's familiar looping script. Her hands shook as she opened the letter. It wasn't a love letter. It was a confession. Miriam, it began. If you are reading this, it means the worst has happened, and my cowardice has finally caught up with me. The Bartletts are not ranchers. They are thieves and murderers. I have helped them legitimize their claim to this valley, a sin for which I can never be forgiven. The true deeds are held by the descendants of Chief Blackwood. I have tried to make amends. I have hidden the original treaty documents, the only legal proof of ownership. They are safe. In this ledger you will find a map. The key is the verse I preached the day Jonah was born. The truth will set you free. John 8:32. Forgive me. I married a woman whose strength I feared, and I was too weak to deserve it. Caleb. Her head was spinning. A map. The truth will set you free. John 8:32. She grabbed the heavy ledger and frantically flipped through the pages of numbers and transactions. It was meaningless to her. Then she saw it. Tucked into the back, there was a hand-drawn map of the valley. It was covered in lines and symbols. It was a cipher. And the key was John 8:32. The 8th page, the 32nd line. Or maybe the 32nd page, the 8th line. She scrambled for Caleb's Bible, her heart pounding. She found the verse, but the words themselves offered no clue. It had to be the numbers. She went back to the ledger. Page 8, line 32. It was an entry for a sale of 50 head of cattle. Page 32, line 8. A payment for barbed wire. It made no sense. Then Ruthie, who had woken up and was now standing in the doorway, her eyes puffy from crying, pointed a small finger at the map. That looks like the old mission, she said sleepily, pointing to a crudely drawn square on the map. The one Papa took us to, the one with the broken bell. The broken bell. Miriam looked closer at the map. Next to the square was a small drawing of a bell with a crack in it, and next to that, a series of numbers. 8. 32. It wasn't a page and a line. It was a sequence. It was a combination. The old mission church, abandoned for 50 years, sat on the edge of Bartlett's property. It was the last place anyone would think to look. Caleb had hidden the proof there, and he had left her the key to find it. She knew what she had to do. Bartlett and his men thought they had won. They had Nakai. They would torture him, try to force him to tell them where the proof was. But they didn't know that the key wasn't with him. It was with her. She looked at her sleeping children, their innocent faces a stark reminder of what was at stake. She couldn't leave them, but she couldn't let Nakai die. Just then, there was a soft tap on the window. She jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Elias. He gestured for her to come outside. She met him on the porch. the cool night air a shock to her system. "They took him to the old holding pen on the north end of their ranch," he whispered, his face etched with worry. "They're not taking him to the law. They're going to kill him, Miriam. Probably before sunrise." "I have to go there," she said, her voice firm. Elias looked at her like she was crazy. "That's suicide. The place is crawling with his men." "I don't have a choice, Elias," she said, her eyes blazing with a fire he'd never seen before. "Caleb left me a map. I know where the proof is, but I can't get it without creating a diversion. I need you to do something for me." She explained her desperate, half-baked plan. It was insane. It would probably get them both killed, but it was the only chance they had. Elias listened, his expression grim. He looked at her, at the preacher's quiet widow, now transformed into a fierce warrior fighting for a man she barely knew. He remembered his promise to Caleb, to look out for his family if the worst happened. He slowly nodded. "All right, Miriam," he said, pulling his hat down low. "Let's go start a fire." The plan was simple, and simplicity was its only virtue. While Elias created a diversion, a fire in one of Bartlett's hay barns on the far side of the ranch, Miriam would use the chaos to sneak into the old mission, find the documents, and then, if there was a God in heaven, find a way to free Nakai. She left her children with a neighbor she trusted, a silent, grim-faced woman who asked no questions, simply nodding and taking Ruthie's hand. The kiss she gave each of her children felt like it might be the last. The ride to the mission was a blur of shadows and adrenaline. She kept to the ravines, the moonlight her only guide. In the distance, she saw a faint orange glow bloom against the night sky, followed by the sound of faint, frantic shouting. Elias had done his part. Now it was her turn. The old mission was even more decrepit than she remembered. Its adobe walls were crumbling, and the roof had collapsed in the center, leaving it open to the stars. The broken bell hung silently in its tower, a dark, skeletal shape against the moon. She slipped through a gap in the wall, her heart hammering. Inside, it was a graveyard of broken pews and dust. She found the altar, just as Ruthie had described. According to Caleb's map, the hiding place was beneath it, a loose flagstone. She knelt, her fingers searching the cracks. She found it. With a grunt, she pried the heavy stone up. Underneath was a small, lead-lined box. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a stack of yellow documents and a treaty bearing the official seal of the United States government. She had it. The truth. But as she stood up, clutching the box, a shadow detached itself from the darkness in the corner of the mission. "I knew you had a little more to you than just greed," a voice drawled. It was Bartlett. He hadn't gone to the fire. He had waited. He had known she would come. Two of his men stepped out from behind the crumbling pillars, rifles leveled at her chest. She was trapped. "I have to hand it to the preacher," Bartlett said, walking toward her, his spurs jingling ominously in the silence. "He was a clever coward, but not clever enough. Now give me the box." Miriam clutched the box to her chest. "It's over, Bartlett. This proves you're a thief." He laughed. "This proves nothing if you're not alive to show it to anyone." He nodded to his men. "Kill her, and make it look like an accident." But as his men raised their rifles, a voice cut through the darkness from the gaping hole in the roof above. "Drop it!" Everyone looked up. Standing on the crumbling wall, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, was Nakai. He wasn't bound. He was holding a rifle, and it was aimed directly at Bartlett's head. He must have escaped in the chaos of the fire. Bartlett's eyes went wide with fury and disbelief. "How?" he snarled. "You should be dead." "I'm harder to kill than your hired thugs," Nakai said, his voice cold as ice. In that split second of distraction, Miriam acted. She swung the heavy lead box with all her might, smashing it against the face of the man closest to her. He went down with a grunt. The second man turned his rifle on her, but before he could fire, a shot rang out, not from Nakai but from the mission's doorway. The man crumpled to the ground. Standing there, smoke curling from the barrel of his pistol, was Sheriff Elias Truell. "Evening, Bartlett," Elias said, his voice calm. "Looks like your party's over." It was a standoff. Bartlett, caught between Nakai on the roof and Elias at the door. He was trapped, but he wasn't a man who surrendered. With a roar of rage, he grabbed Miriam, pulling her in front of him as a shield and pressing a pistol to her temple. "Nobody moves or the widow dies!" he screamed. The air grew thick with tension. Elias and Nikai held their positions, unable to risk a shot. Miriam's mind raced. She could feel Bartlett's hot, rancid breath on her neck. This was it. This was how it ended. But then she looked past Bartlett's shoulder and saw Nikai's eyes. He wasn't looking at Bartlett. He was looking at the bell tower. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The broken bell. He was telling her something. She remembered a story Ruthie had told him about a coyote that escaped a trap by making the rocks fall. It was a crazy, desperate idea, but it was all she had. "Now!" Nikai yelled. Elias, understanding instantly, fired his pistol, not at Bartlett, but at the ancient, rotting rope holding up the heavy bronze bell. The shot echoed like a cannon in the small space. The rope snapped. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting wood, the half-ton bell broke free from its mooring. It didn't just fall. It swung, crashing through the rotted timbers of the tower and plummeting directly toward the spot where Bartlett stood. He looked up, his face a mask of pure terror. In that split second of hesitation, Miriam drove her elbow back into his ribs and threw herself to the side. The bell hit the ground with a deafening, earth-shattering crash, missing her by inches and crushing Bartlett beneath its immense weight. A cloud of dust and silence filled the mission. It was over. The aftermath was a quiet affair. With the documents Miriam recovered and Elias's testimony, the truth about the Bartlett clan finally came out. They weren't just thieves. Their entire empire was built on a foundation of murder and lies. The circuit judge who had signed Nikai's warrant was implicated, his corruption exposed. The town of Dove's Hollow was forced to look at its own reflection, to acknowledge the dark secrets it had allowed to fester in its shadow. But that's a story for another day. Our story ends where it began, under the shade of the cottonwood trees. Miriam, Nikai, Jonah, and Ruthie stood by the stream, the late afternoon sun casting long, gentle shadows. The town was slowly, painfully, starting to heal. There were still whispers, still sideways glances, but now they were tinged with a grudging respect. Miriam was no longer just the preacher's widow. She was the woman who had faced down the devil and won. Nikai was no longer a stranger. He was the man who had come back for them, the rightful heir to the valley, though he had no interest in claiming it. All he wanted was peace. Later that evening, as the children slept and the fire burned low, Nikai sat across from Miriam at the small wooden table. He reached across and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. In his touch, she felt the promise of a future, not one built on rules and expectations, but on shared silence and quiet strength. He then pressed something small and smooth into her palm. It was a wooden ring, carved from the piece of wood he had worked on for weeks. It was a perfect, unbroken circle. It wasn't a proposal, not in the way the town would understand it. It was something more profound, a symbol of a family that had not been born of blood or law, but forged in fire and faith, a family of choice. Miriam closed her hand around it, the wood warm against her skin. Home, she realized, wasn't a house with four walls. It was the safe space between two people who had found each other in the wilderness. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt like she was finally home. This story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest strength is found when we defy expectations and choose our own family, our own path, and our own truth. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments, what would you have risked for a stranger? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.